Good morning. Oh no, I'm going to need a lot more love than that on a Sunday morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
I am so happy to be here. I was at an event a handful of years ago in New York, and a friend was introducing me around to folks, and she said, "This is my friend Kathy Lemay. She's a great fundraiser." And this woman looked at me and paused for a moment and said, "Oh, you're a fundraiser." I became so popular in her eyes at that moment. And I paused and I looked at her and I said, "Well, if by fundraiser you mean I'm a social justice wealth redistributor who helps people part with their earthly goods in service to the profound generosity within them that enables them to transform the world that they know is possible, why then yes, I am a fundraiser." She kind of ignored me rest of the time, though. I think as she saw me, she's like, "That woman's going to make me redistribute my wealth. I can't." I didn't see her much after that. I have had the absolute joy, privilege, and honor of spending my entire life doing social change and social justice work. I started when I was 13 years old. I remember going door to door. I lived in the oldest mill town in the United States, and we had these small farms, and this huge factory farm wanted to move in, and I was an animal rights activist from back in the day. And at 13, I went door to door with a clipboard to ask people to protest. And I remember, and by the way, this is a know your audience moment, knocked on this door, and this older gentleman answered, and I said, "Did you know that they're herding baby male chicks on the farm down the street? You have to sign this and help me." And he paused, and he looked over his shoulder to his wife and said, "There's some girl here about a chicken?" But we successfully did it, and 30 years later, I have the joy of still being in this work, and I have to tell you something. This work of philanthropy and social justice and social change has transformed in 3 decades in a way that myself and those of us who've been lucky enough to do this work did not think we would see in our lifetime. Once upon a time, I would tell people I was a community activist and a social change fundraiser, and I would get, "Do you have health insurance with that? What is that job?" And now when I tell people that, they say, "I love that, I wish that I could do this." This is an extraordinary time, as all of these speakers have been sharing. And at the same time, when something gets large and begins to take on a scale of critical mass, something starts to shift in it. And as I have watched from what was once called do-gooders to now becoming a philanthropic global industry around the world, where once there were a handful of people known as philanthropists, and now what we understand is big names, big causes, big wallets, and everyone's behind the work. And there's been this shift about how we look at how social change happens. And those of you who maybe have ever looked for funding for a project you care about, raise your hand if you've ever had to ask anybody for a little bit of money. You're starting to hear and see some terms that once upon a time occupied just the space of the business world. What is the return on investment? What is the business model? Is it scalable? Is it replicable? What's your percentage overhead? And while in this, there has been a gift for nonprofits who have struggled to create the structure to accelerate their critical missions, there has also been a bit of a loss. And here's what I mean by that. When I was 23 years old, I was working and living in Seattle, Washington. I was working for an aid service organization, walking to work one day, and there's outdoor magazine newsstands all over Seattle, and I remember Time and Newsweek and walking by and stopping. And on the covers of these issues were Bosnian Muslim women screaming. And I remember grabbing both those issues, going to work, reading these articles from beginning to end, and reading about these modern day rape camps that women in Eastern Europe where just a decade before the Olympics had been hosted, were inside these rape camps as a part and an act of war. Have you ever had that feeling as though somebody punched you right in the solar plexus and you couldn't catch your breath? And I froze, and I thought, no, this cannot be happening. This cannot be happening, and I have to tell you, I didn't know what to do. I was 23 years old. I didn't make any money. I didn't know anybody with money. I didn't know anyone influential. I was really thrilled if I could pay my rent on time. And I looked at these world leaders who could not do anything about this, and I thought, what is it that I could do? And to these days, my gratitude to my mother who taught me, you don't just talk about a problem, you do something about it. And so I went and listened and learned everything I could about Bosnia and the Balkans. I have to tell you, before this, I had kind of a not ideal education system growing up. I'm not sure I could have pointed this part of the world out on a map. And 7 months later, I had a backpack and was flying Air Croatia into the middle of a war by myself, thinking, if it were me, I hope other women would come. So I had to go. P.S. Don't fly Air Croatia. I remember me and 6 Serbian businessmen, and they're just staring at me. And I'm thinking, do we need any duct tape or WD-40 for this plane? Is this gonna get us there? And I landed in this war-torn country, not having ever traveled in my life. And if you talk about moments in time that transform you, as you can imagine what this did for me, I learned of survival and strength and resiliency and brilliance and courage and fierceness for people who felt they had been forgotten by the globe. And I had the gift of spending a few weeks there. And then I remember as I worked in refugee camps and I swept floors and I fed people and I listened. And I had a translator and I listened. And I remember the people saying to me who I met, thank you for coming, thank you for listening. And I remember this one woman said, thank you for witnessing my life. And as I was leaving, we could not go into the airport at that point. The Serbian military had taken over the airport so that no more aid can come in and out. And I was brought to the train station by my translator, and there was this woman who ran the organization that I was volunteering for. And I have to tell you, during my duration there, she only said good morning to me, and then she did not speak to me the rest of the time. So I didn't spend that much time with her. But that day, she came to the train station. And I'm just about to board on the train, and my translator says to me, she wants to tell you something. And this is what my translator interpreted for me. This woman said to me, I knew the war had reached my people and my home the day the Serbian military kicked down my door, pulled out my husband and my 8-year-old son and me, and in front of me shot my husband and my 8-year-old son in our front yard, laughed and walked away. And she said, and I stood there, and there is my life dead on my front lawn. And she said, the only thing that I could remember was the very last pin that my son had made me in his art class. She said, I went right back into my home. I opened this box. So many mothers have the box of all the things their children have made. And she said, I remember he made this pin for me, and it was this little metal wire, and there was stone and glass, and it was beautiful. And she said, he gave it to me, and I remember saying, I love this, it's beautiful, and I was busy that day. And I put it in the box and closed it. She said, I opened it, and I picked it up, and I held it and said, this is the last thing my boy will ever make for me. And I am standing there thinking, just keep breathing with this courage that is in front of me. And she slid her hand into her pocket and pulled this gift out that her son made her. She handed it to me and she said, now you are the child that I lost. This moment of such profound humanity, such profound love, in the most impossible, brutal circumstances somebody has ever asked to witness or be a part of, and she endured it. I would ask you now, what exactly is the return on investment in that moment? What is the scalable business model for that? What is the percentage overhead for a moment like that? And what does it mean when we gauge social change only in business terms? Because I have here in the audience my dear friend Evelyn, who runs the most extraordinary group called the Lollipop Theater. This fantastic woman goes to studios and talks them into giving her movies for kids that have not yet been released in theaters. She holds them close to her chest. She flies to Children's Hospital because these kids are so terminal, they will not live for this movie to make it in the theater. She has given parents the last thing that they can give their children. And these children light up. And they do those stanchions and the red carpet. And kids get popcorn and there's movie tickets. And there's a child who had that experience and then the next day passed away. Do you know some of the funding community has said to her, that's not a very good return on investment because that day you only helped 5 children. We could do 100 with a budget like that. I remember in the year 2000 working in rural Bosnia doing microcredit. And back to that sense of the profound resiliency of people around this globe who have so much to teach Americans, so much about courage and fierceness. And I remember being in this rural community and having to step over landmines to get to these women who all showed up to repay their loans in the best outfits they could find. And I remember coming back to DC and meeting with donors and donors asking me, but what's the repayment rate on these loans? And happily, the repayment rate was 99%, and I got that that was how the community at that point was gauging success and impact, was the repayment rate on a loan. And here is the shadow side of some of these things like microcredit, because there are many women around the world who have borrowed a second loan to make the payment on their first loan on time to maintain that 99%, because that is what the model has said is success. What is the role of humanity in this modern philanthropic movement? How do you gauge a child's last film and the only thing that that little person heard or saw or witnessed that was joy, and their beautiful parents standing by and watching them smile for the last time? There is no scalability model for someone's humanity. It is someone's humanity. As we've been talking, you'll hear so much these days about investing in women and girls. Are you all starting to hear that? And people saying, the thing is, when you invest in a woman and girl, she puts it in her family. It supports the community. It supports the world. That is a 100% true and accurate statement, and that is played out every day throughout the globe by extraordinary women and mothers everywhere. And guess why we should invest in women and girls? Because they were born. What is the role of humanity in this modern philanthropic movement? When I was 23 years old and standing in Bosnia, and this woman handed me the last gift that her son made for her, there is no words for the impact that's had on my life and the way that I now move through the world. And when I get in my own way, or I get overwhelmed by the budget I have to make, or bylaws, or big, black tie affairs that you have to go to, and all of this stuff that's become an industry around humanity and change. I remember her by the train. I remember my mother raising my sisters and I on $6,000 a year and getting the 3 of us to college, the first in our family. I remember the countless people I've met who've never had a building named after them, who will not get an award, who will not have their name in 26-point font in a newsletter. And they are this globe's extraordinary change agents, and make no mistake about that. And what I ask of us is, in the midst of imagining what can be, to reconnect with who we know we are. Philanthropy and social change is not a profession, it is a purpose. It is not about bottom line, it is a belief system. It is not about success, it is about significance. It is not about, do you have enough money? It is knowing that you matter. I'm going to ask you to remember, when you were growing up, some profoundly generous and loving act that someone in your life performed. They did not get credit for it. No one might have noticed, but you saw it. And over the course of the day, I want you to call on that and reflect in it and recognize that that person's humanity shaped yours. And when we come from a place not of what is the financial return on this investment, but instead we understand the metrics of success is the fullest expansion of our humanity. Seeing someone for who they are, not what they can contribute to you, but that they matter because they were born and they're here. Please, in this quest for this work, come back to that every single day, all the time. And for those of you seeking funding, and y'all raise your hands, by the way, you're going to have to be fierce. You're going to have courage. You're going to have to look at the people with the big wallets who you kind of want to give them the nice brochures and give them the perfect PowerPoint and say all the right things. And you're going to have to say to them, may I ask you a favor? Can you and I together talk about what success means and looks like? Because I want to hear your ideas, and I got to tell you, I have a couple of my own. And what if we built that together? Do not be afraid to turn down money that doesn't have heart or humanity. What? Yes, I just said that. How we build what we build will inform what we create. Being on this stage with the people who have preceded me, there are no words. There are literally no words. I am this girl from a mill town. I am this girl who in the 70s and 80s was part of that group of kind of invisible white Americans called the working poor. It is extraordinary and astonishing to me every single day of my life that I am in this field called philanthropy, because I didn't even know there was such a thing. I thought it was things like Dynasty and Dallas. I thought it was people who sat at big oak tables and gigantic scissors cutting ribbons and champagne beans. I'm like, well, y'all not going to drink that? Because I'll take that. You don't need to smash that on that boat. And then I got, as I did the work, what the great Teddy Roosevelt once said about philanthropy and social change and commitment. Do what you can with what you have where you are. Every single one of you matters to this work, not because of the degrees you have, the status that you hold, the zip code you live in, but because you were born and you're here and you matter. And do not let a single person in this sector tell you that that is just the fluff of this work. Please remind yourself who you are, and when you're with them, remind them of who they are. And I will close with this one story about that remembrance. I wrote this book, and a man who lived nearby me found the book and called me and said, Kathy, will you help me create this generosity plan, which is what I call this work instead of philanthropy. And I met with him, and I have to tell you, he shows up and he has the most impressive spreadsheet I've ever seen of any person I've ever worked with. And on this spreadsheet is the name of every group he ever has given to, the dollar amount for 3 years in a row, the committee he's volunteered on, and I'm not kidding, the number of hours that he's contributed. And I looked at him and I said, this is unbelievable. I wrote the book on this, and I don't even have one of these, honey. And I said, how come you hired me? And he said, because when I look at this, Kathy, I don't feel anything. Aren't I supposed to feel something? And I said, indeed you are. And I said to him, this is an impressive thing you've done here. Who taught you about this? And he said, no one. I just found it and showed up and learned. And in my work with people around going back to your giving roots, and I mean your ancestral giving roots, I kept pulling and pulling. And who influenced this man to be so extraordinary? And I have to tell you, he didn't want to talk to me about it. He kept dodging the questions. He kept trying to find a way to change the topic. And I said, was it your parents? And his head dropped and he said, no. And I said, would you please talk to me about this so I can understand? And he said, I look back now and I realize, Kathy, that at the very least my father was a paranoid schizophrenic and untreated. And my mother either was or was so fully caught up in his disease. He said, we went to church once one Sunday, my sister, brother, and I, and my parents, and when we came home, my father said, they want to take everything away from us. We're never going back there again. He said, my parents didn't work or leave the house. They were home all the time. We never had people over. He grew up pretty poor, and I asked him if he would walk me through what a day in the life looked like. He said, I had a much older brother who, at one point, was just kind of done with the family and disappeared. And nobody talked about where he went or what happened. He was just gone. And my friend did not feel he could leave. He had a baby sister who he wanted to take care of. And he said, we literally had to cross the train tracks because we lived on the wrong side of the tracks to get to the nice school. And I said, but we've got teachers and coaches and guidance counselors. Was anyone there taking care of you and your sister and watching out for you? And he said, no, we were the scholarship kids and we were quiet. And I said, what was your sister like? Was she a little more social? And he said, my sister was born with a severe facial disfigurement. And he said, if you can imagine, if you might recall and remember how cruel kids can be, now add that in. And he said, so I protected her when people threw rocks at her and called her names. I took care of her. And I'm trying to understand how he gets from here to being on these boards of these extraordinarily great places in New England that are pretty impressive. And he said to me, I just survived, Kathy. We just survived. And I said, so you'd go to school, no one's paying attention to you, you're coming back over the train tracks. Did you ever go? And he said, oh, you know what? We did 3 or 4 days a week. My sister and I did the shopping at literally this little mom and pop store. And so there was a nice man there, Lewis, who owned that. And he stops in the middle of this story. And he turns his head from me, and when he comes back, there's tears in his eyes and this smile that I had not yet seen. And I said, can you tell me what you just recalled? And he said, we would do this shopping, and I would bring these baskets of food, and my sister kind of stood quietly by me. And Lewis would say to me, it's good to see you. Hey, you know what? Let's put this on your father's tab. And he said, Kathy, there was no tab. My father never went there. And he said, I'm realizing now for the 1.5 years that my sister and I did shopping for our family, that man paid all of our grocery bills for us. And I paused and said, would you do me a favor? Would you tell me what you do that's exactly like that today, that is not on this spreadsheet, and is not a board of directors, an investment committee, a gala honorary chairperson? What do you do that's exactly like that? And his smile got bigger, and he said, I have a dear friend who's a contractor, and he has 4 boys under 10, and 2 years ago his wife died of cancer, and he's raising those boys on his own. And the life of a contractor, as many of you might know, is hit or miss, and the money is scarce. And he said, but he will not take a gift or a handout. He will not do it. And he said, but Kathy, those boys love the Boston Red Sox. They love them. And he said, I give him season tickets to the Boston Red Sox every year. He thinks I get them from my company and that I'm allowed to give them to who I want. If you don't live in Massachusetts, I'll tell you season tickets to the Boston Red Sox are anywhere from $40,000 to $60,000 a year. And I said, so what does this work mean to you? Outside of the committees and all of that, what does this work mean to you? And he said, I don't know if I can change the world, but I can change one person's world. And so today I invite you to stay true to your humanity and your heart and your generosity. And please know that I think that's the key to unlocking it all. Thank you so, so much.